up here. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Mike Berger. I'm the Senior Director of Conservation for Audubon's Connecticut and New York programs. And I'm also serving as an interim executive director at the time. So the purpose of this presentation today is to share with you the latest thinking on our bird-friendly community strategy. As many of you know, this is one of Audubon's 5 main conservation priorities or strategies and applies across the country. What we're presenting today is our new version of this strategy, in which the core focus of the bird-friendly community strategy has been shaped through the integration of equity, diversity, and inclusion, climate action, and youth development. I want to get your feedback on how this reshaped strategy resonates with you. You know, what makes sense, what doesn't, and to field any questions you might have. Could we go to the next slide, please, Ken? So before we get into the meat of the presentation, I want to take a minute just to define Audubon's bird-friendly community strategy to provide the foundation on which our new strategy is built. The bird-friendly community strategy or conservation strategy works with birds' needs in the places we share with them, specifically by providing food, shelter, safe passage, and places to raise their young. In turn, birds offer us a richer, more beautiful, and healthful place to live. As you can see, this strategy at its core is about birds and people, and benefits to both of them. In addition, central to the initial development of the bird-friendly community strategy during Audubon's strategic planning process several years ago is the understanding that where people live is where Audubon is going to engage them and persuade them to become part of Audubon, to join our conservation movement. So more than any of the other 5 main conservation strategies, the bird-friendly community strategy is as much an engagement strategy as it is a conservation strategy. Not surprisingly then, as you will hear, our vision is that much of this work will flow from our centers, which I heard recently described as Audubon's front porch. It's where we meet our neighbors, which I love. And also through our chapters, which have a presence in many communities throughout our 2 states. Next slide, please, Ken. So in this presentation, we're going to start with the issues that our bird strategy addresses, including the issues for birds, for people, and for Audubon as an organization. Following that, I think you can, yeah, thank you. We'll talk about the impacts we're striving for through this strategy on all 3 of those elements: birds, people, and Audubon. And next, we'll describe the programs and the work that will compose this strategy, providing examples and how they build on Audubon's unique position and strengths. And finally, we'll finish with your questions and observations. Next slide, please. I know everyone has heard this over the last year. It was big enough news, hard to ignore even if you aren't in the bird world. But you know, in spite of decades of conservation efforts, North America has lost about 3 billion birds since 1970. 1 in 8 bird species are threatened with global extinction. And Audubon's own modeling predicts that climate change puts 2/3 of North American species at risk. Though there are other factors at work in other landscapes, there's no denying that the built environment presents real threats to birds, including pesticides, collisions with structures, light pollution, domestic predators, sterile lawns, exotic plants, on and on. Bird populations are in decline, and we need to do better across the board. This isn't a condemnation of our past efforts. I think things would undoubtedly be much worse had those not happened, but rather it's an acknowledgement that there's this need to evolve and to do more, to engage more people in our fight for birds and the places they need, and to address those big issues that affect both birds and people. Next slide, please, Ken. 88% of the people in Connecticut and New York live in urban areas and may lack access to nature, which has significant negative implications for people's physical and emotional well-being. Some recent research, less than a year old, finds that the United States has fewer forests, streams, wetlands, and other natural places near where Black, Latino, and Asian American people live. And notably, families with children, especially families of color with children, have less access to nature nearby than the rest of the country. Birds can be an effective hook for connecting with people, but I think our work often lacks relevance to the priorities, health, and welfare of communities of color. To be more relevant, our community engagement efforts must address environmental issues in the context of social and economic conditions. They must provide community benefits. So at Audubon, all staff are being trained to recognize choice points and how to view our work through a lens of equity and inclusion, and allowing that lens to shape our goals for our work. With our bird-friendly community strategy, we have more flexibility in deciding where to work than we have for any of our other conservation strategies. We could be working in any community in our 2 states, but we don't have the capacity to work in all of them. So we have choices to make, and we're asking ourselves, who benefits from this work? Are those benefits equitable? Not equal, but equitable. That is, purposefully benefiting those who historically have benefited least. Along the way, there are going to be many choice points in co-creating programs in the communities where we're working, prioritizing our future programs, identifying, supporting partnerships, etc. And finally, this is an important issue for Audubon as an organization. We're a proud conservation organization, more than 115 years old, with many notable successes, both past and present. But we don't look a lot like a cross-section of America today, and certainly not a lot like America of tomorrow. Increasing the effectiveness and the relevance of Audubon is going to require that we attract and engage more people of our movement, especially a greater diversity of people. The larger and more diverse that group of people who consider themselves part of Audubon is the more effective that we're going to be in addressing the big environmental problems that affect birds and people. And again, 88% of the people in our 2 states live in urban areas, and this strategy is largely about engaging them. In a recent presentation on equity, diversity, and inclusion, Audubon's CEO, David Yarnold, said, "You understand that becoming more inclusive is a business imperative to grow and strengthen your organizations and the influence you have, and a moral imperative to do the right things for your communities." That's something that is guiding this work for bird-friendly communities. Next slide, please. So ultimately, what we're trying to achieve through this bird-friendly community strategy is a more diverse, stronger, more effective Audubon. We expect that we can increase the diversity of Audubon, Connecticut, and New York's active membership by at least 3 to 5% per year, deepening our relevance to a racially and generationally diverse coalition. We want to see community benefits in the form of education, skills, employment, youth career development, as well as healthy green spaces and connection to nature. This is one of our choice points. We also, of course, want to see healthier bird habitats in communities throughout our 2 states where native plants are used instead of non-natives. And we want to reduce migration hazards that birds encounter in these areas. So that's the stage that I wanted to set. And I'm going to turn it over to Ken Elkins for the next part of this presentation. He's the Community Conservation Manager for Audubon, Connecticut and New York. Ken?
Thanks, Mike. For many of us, we consider the flagship program of bird-friendly communities has been the Plants for Birds program. It's extremely important for birds. Research from our partners at Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute found that only yards that were able to produce enough chickadees to sustain a stable population were those with a plant composition made up of more than 70% of native plants. Because more than 90% of our herbivorous insects will only eat one or a few different species of native plants, the use of these plants in landscaping is essential to ensure breeding birds have enough insect prey to eat. We've had other thoughts on planting 1 million plants across the country, and people have asked us, so how many plants do we need? And this new research is going to help us in sharing the science of how this is important and how we can further bird conservation in the places we share with them. For the same reason, native plants are also likely critical for other resident birds, endangered species and migratory species. And it's not just backyards on the East Coast. So as we work with new partners, we're finding that Plants for Birds is benefiting birds, but also benefiting people. This is an active conservation action, and it can be highly relevant to people's lives. Access to green spaces and increased biodiversity makes our communities more resilient to climate change. It improves public health and improves real estate values. When Audubon partners with school teachers or healthcare workers or landscaping professionals, it brings birds into their work and they develop their own stories of why birds matter. Plant for Bird programs are a key part of how our centers and chapters envision their role in our conservation strategies. Each center and most chapters have a demonstration garden they use to further their outreach and have a great chance of increasing volunteerism. This is work our communities expect from Audubon too, opportunities to support local conservation. To increase the impact of Plants for Birds, we're also expanding our partnerships and training to the gardening and nursery professionals. I wish I had time to list all the creative Plants for Birds programs that our chapters have created to provide opportunities for conservation action and bring people to the Audubon movement. We also have some newer work within BFC, and I think for many of us, we've experienced a bird injured or killed from a window strike. It makes it personal when your windows caused a collision, and it is probably the first time many in our communities have ever thought about the human impacts on birds. Window collisions happen wherever we share spaces with birds, not just in cities, but in rural areas too, which brings new people to our work. Humans create many hazards to birds in urban, suburban, and rural areas, not just window collisions, but pesticides, light and sound pollution. The sheer number of homes and glass windows makes this one of the biggest killers of birds in the US, with up to 1 billion birds dying as a result of glass collisions each year. Several of our priority forest birds are among those species most vulnerable to window collisions, including golden wing and Canada warblers, American woodcock, and wood thrush. The US Fish and Wildlife Service estimates that as many as 72 million birds die each year from pesticide poisoning. The true impact of pesticides on birds is difficult to gauge though. Pollution and toxins can cause sublethal effects that do not directly kill birds, but reduce their longevity or their reproductive rates. So how can we help provide safe passage for migratory birds? We're going to begin with engaging volunteers in monitoring and identifying key buildings that retrofitting would reduce collisions. These community science opportunities are related to collisions. There's iNaturalist projects like the Yale New Haven project, and also the D-Bird app from New York City Audubon. They're working on making that software available to beyond the metro area this coming year. I think many of us are also familiar with the Lights Out campaign with New York City Audubon Society in particular. And now we're going to have better opportunities for our chapters and centers to partner with the local chapters of the International Dark Sky Association. We can also think about bringing a larger impact to reducing hazards. We could train and influence professionals in the architectural construction fields, not just on only recommending bird-safe glass and designs, but why they're a better choice for the bottom line of commercial buildings. Policy work is also going to be critical to safe passage. In both New York and Connecticut, we have opportunities this year to influence policy related to pesticide use and bird-safe buildings. One tactic related to policy that we'll be expanding for both Plants for Birds and bird-safe buildings is support for our centers and chapters in developing partnerships to further our PRO's work. PROs stand for proclamations, resolutions, and ordinances. Relationships built by chapters or centers will be integral as we work to pass these proclamations, resolutions, and ordinances in towns and cities. Pros can elevate Audubon's work for the press and the public. It creates meaningful change at the local level, and our communities can enhance habitat and reduce threats to birds. And it can be an avenue to both engage non-traditional partners in prose passage, while also providing an opportunity for skill building and civic engagement that some of our partners may be seeking. So as we strive to make our communities as bird-friendly as possible and bring more people along with us while we do, passing legislation on the use and protection of native plants, lighting, and bird-safe buildings can ensure that our work will have a long-lasting effects for birds and climate, and that will build the network of advocates needed to create change for our other initiatives and legislative priorities too. So you've heard me mentioning the necessity and power of our partnerships. With some creativity, we can partner with organizations that do not have a conservation mission. Together, with simple acts of hope, everyone can help make their community bird friendly. And as Mike mentioned, birds have been Audubon's hook, and improving conditions for birds in the places we share is still our goal. Our BFC staff, our chapters, and our centers, though, have found partnerships are more impactful and sustainable when we engage in two-way listening and co-creation. To share a few examples of our best projects that benefit birds and benefit our communities while strengthening our Audubon network, I'd like to now pass this along to Jillian Bell, our Bird Friendly Communities Project Coordinator.
Thanks, Ken. So with my time, I'm going to introduce you to some of the work on the ground that BFC is both leading and a part of. I say a part of because so much of this work depends on our increased capacity through the partnerships that we've been able to form with local organizations and community groups doing work on the ground in the communities that we look to work in. They provide us the opportunity to magnify our work and our impact as well as to engage in that two-way listening and co-creation that Ken just mentioned. So we can meet the needs of our community partners while also promoting Audubon's goals and the Audubon name amongst audiences that we've not previously engaged. When I say two-way listening and co-creation, I mean that we're not only going in with our own birdie agenda, but that we are actively listening to the needs of our communities and collaboratively figuring out the best way forward to get our collective needs met through our partnership, thus resulting in community buy-in and long-term sustainability of the projects. This is a picture of one of our community teams that worked on creating the Cherry Ann Urban Oases site. It's one of 15 urban oases in the state, and it straddles the New Haven and Hamden border here in Connecticut. It was a 5-acre space at the end of a dead-end street, and it was used as a brush dump and of late years, a dumping ground. It had become overrun with invasive plants and trash, and residents wanted a safe and accessible park for their children to play in because the kids used to play in the street. So through the two-way listening process between partners and the community, we were able to advance our own goals of creating more much needed urban bird-friendly habitat, and also the community's goals of having a safe and accessible park for their children to play in. The benefits of this partnership went far beyond the initial vision for the space, with the city actually being inspired by the work of this partnership to invest in more infrastructure. Let me say that again, more infrastructure for the space, adding a playground and most recently a splash pad. You may be wondering how we target which communities we'd like to work in and with, and we'll take a look at that with this next slide. So Bird Friendly Communities is informed and able to target which communities we work in through Audubon's Urban Oases GIS site selection tool that lets us take a look at multiple factor layers when choosing where our work leads us. Some examples of the layers we can examine are important bird areas, where parks and schools are located, population density, per capita income, and tree canopy cover. Once we figure out where we are going to work, our next challenge has been figuring out how we're going to do this intensive work on the ground in, and more importantly, with these various communities. That's where our partnerships come in. Our biggest partnership to date is in New Haven, and it began back in 2013. This special partnership, called the New Haven Harbor Watershed Urban Wildlife Refuge Partnership, creates a citywide network of enhanced green spaces in schoolyards, parks, college campuses, land trust land, urban greenways, and residential yards. This partnership allows us to engage both students and adults across different generations in habitat restoration, community science, and leadership and green job skills training. For example, our partner Common Ground already provides environmental education programming to almost all of the K through 8 schools here in New Haven, and URI works with 50 local neighborhood groups a year in New Haven. So building on the great work that is already taking place by bringing it all under one umbrella and ensures that our efforts provide habitat for birds, improves not only the health of the Long Island Sound, but also the communities that we're working in. Next slide, please, Ken. A perfect example of this partnership at work can be seen through the work of the Schoolyard Habitat Program. It's a program designed to restore native plant habitat on school grounds, to connect school communities with nature, to inspire the next generation of conservation leaders, and to train teachers in integrating their habitats into their curriculum, making it a sustainable venture for both them and for us. This is the Edgewood Schoolyard Habitat unveiling ceremony in New Haven. And here we can see a student, teachers, partners, city officials, so many people coming together to make this work possible. And because of this increased capacity, to date, we have 29 designated schoolyard habitat sites statewide, with our 30th planning to unveil later this spring. We also have trained over 460 teachers that go on to teach Audubon created lessons after our time together. And we've engaged in call to action over 17,600 people through our schoolyard habitat workshops, planting days, and other programming. Next slide, please, Ken. A shining example from our chapter network is the Urbanscapes Native Plant Nursery that Monunketuk Audubon Society and CPEN, a nonprofit organization dedicated to repurposing vacant lots into green spaces in New Haven, that began this past summer. Through this partnership, they were able to co-create a project that put a vacant lot in a densely populated urban area to good use. They grew almost, I think it was 450 native plants to sale. And this ongoing project created an opportunity for Audubon to provide our expertise and education around the benefits of native plants for birds, as well as employment for the students that assisted with the project, and saw $2,500 worth of native plants given away to the local area, the neighborhood of New Hallville, where the nursery is located. Since the Urban Chapter Network already drives this work in local areas from Long Island to upstate New York and Connecticut, Audubon chapter volunteers work in parks, at local libraries, and directly with homeowners. Together, and also by collaborating with our center programming, we can help chapters target this work where it makes the biggest difference for birds and for people. This is the direction that we're looking to go in as we move forward with bird-friendly communities, more co-creation with the communities we work in to not only make our projects more sustainable and long-lasting, but to increase ownership of the projects by the communities that we work in, and also to spread our reach in areas that may not have a center nearby, but one that has a local chapter that can take the lead in creating more BFC across our states. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Eric Lind. He's the Director of Center Programs and Education, so he can share with you some examples of BFC programs at our centers that benefit birds and benefit our communities while strengthening our Audubon network. Thanks, y'all.
Oh, thank you, Jill. I just want to point us back to the earlier slides about how much work we have to do and the remaining issues for birds and people. And certainly that is driving our work, our evolution, our desire to be more impactful at centers. And again, as Mike said earlier, in fact, all of the speakers have said, and you'll hear some repeating themes here, BFC is about birds and people and the benefits to both. And like chapters, centers are a public-facing outlet of Audubon's work and will play a really big part in implementing bird-friendly communities. Oh, okay, so you already got the right slide up, thanks. So first, to talk about the conservation elements of BFC at centers. What we're thinking is certainly center programs can directly influence habitat improvements and on-the-ground conservation. We have demonstration areas for native plantings. We can clearly demonstrate how to prevent window collisions in our structures. We don't necessarily want these just to be passive areas where people may or may not see as they visit our centers, but we would interpret them, include workshops, volunteer field work, community science to the thousands of visitors that come through our doors each year. We also can play a role in promoting relevant local, state, and federal legislation and policies as applicable in any one community where a center is, or even at a higher level, depending on the policy issue that's in front of us. So this would require really a closer connection to our policy team, and then figuring out ways to promote and support policies that improve conditions for birds to center audiences. And of course, there's a lot of other work that takes place at centers, and we're also continually working to provide more direct support to forests, coasts, and water, our other conservation strategies as well. Next slide. So now the people part, the communities part of bird-friendly communities. The very first slide Mike showed us, he brought up how the integration of equity, diversity, and inclusion, climate action, and youth development are shaping the direction and the conversation of what BFC can be in Audubon, New York, and Connecticut. So I want to start with youth development. The guy pictured here is Max. He's a former volunteer and intern from Constitution Marsh, and a good example of what we mean by youth development. The time he spent at the center kind of further developed his general interest in nature, as a young person. And we more intentionally provided guidance and support and even some funding through the local chapter to support Max in his undergraduate studies. And we remained connected to him throughout his education. And now he's serving as a leading wildlife biologist for New York State Parks, working with golden wing warbler conservation, tidal wetlands restoration, and countless other projects. Hold on one second. So we would follow this work, these types of successes, and develop new or further existing partnerships with groups to expand our thinking and the process of how we recruit somebody like Max, what community our seasonal staff or our volunteers come from, and so on. So that links directly to the equity, diversity, and inclusion and community-driven conservation theme, I think. Centers certainly know how to develop meaningful, lasting relationships with community partners and community members. And we could leverage that skill and that ability to find a connection to new to Audubon audiences. Lastly, we recognize that environmental degradation and environmental justice and climate are not standalone issues, they're intertwined, and these complex intertwined problems require complex solutions. So, but we've already got some great work underway, and I'll highlight that next. These are just a few examples, and there's several more I could have filled out this slide with, but just a few examples of bird-friendly community programs that are leading us to this further shaping and evolution of this strategy through centers. For example, the Greenwich Audubon Center and the Theodore Roosevelt Audubon Center have teen advisory groups They are providing a very important voice for our staff that we need and can help. We can help them through this youth leadership and youth empowerment concept that we've mentioned a few times. On the ground, we can offer professional trainings. There's some great examples, again, through TR and most recently Constitution Marsh, where we're targeting our audience. In this case, it's landscaping professionals, whether they be landscaper companies, landscape architects or designers, et cetera. And we deliver bird-friendly community messaging, primarily the use of native plants and ecological landscaping, to the people that have a lot of influence over how it can be further implemented throughout a community. So we've got a very focused, targeted audience to deliver our message to for greater return on conservation. Onondaga Lake Conservation Corps is an incredible example of community engagement and organization where a lot of people get together in these work parties and plant native plants, and they're focused on the further restoration of Onondaga Lake and its surrounding watershed through community action and organization. And that's done through the Montezuma Audubon Center in the Finger Lakes region in New York. The For the Birds program, I'm well aware it's not necessarily a center program, but they're leading the way in, again, in this youth development approach. They've developed a youth leadership council, and it's entirely solutions focused, youth driven, and equitable. And it has largely an environmental justice theme. And through that, we can certainly connect to climate. And we have a great start with that work as well. And then the last one here is Youth Climate Summit. And this is being developed at Constitution Marsh. And it's really, again, organizing and empowering youth to develop action plans within their communities to help resolve the climate issue. That's the kind of work that will lead us to greater successes. We can create the next iteration of how a nature center can serve a community or a region. We can state with confidence that our programs are the best in class in a very crowded field of environmental education. We can make a strong case for higher levels of funding, and certainly our increased participation and interest will really help develop and continue to make Audubon relevant in our two states. So with that, I think I turn it over to Ken for the last comments.
Thanks, Eric. So there you have it. This is how we're thinking of the BFC strategy in Connecticut and New York. You've heard and know of our bird-friendly communities programs. They all sound a bit unique because they reflect the communities we're working with. I hope you've noticed those common threads of the spirit of co-creation, ED&I, youth development, and action woven throughout, along with those very direct common themes that benefit bird-friendly communities, benefits birds, benefits our communities, and is strengthening our Audubon network. So now I'll be able to open up for questions and comments. So we'll, if you could, in the chat box, just say that you would like to ask a question or type your questions in, and we'll also allow that you can unmute yourselves. Thank you. If you are interested, please take a look at the chat box. If you haven't opened it up, there are links to see a further article about the Urbanscapes native nursery, a link that was shared, and also links to upcoming workshops and some of the programs that were mentioned today. You can see them more fully in the chat box. Thank you for coming out during your lunch break for most of you today. And here are some questions coming in now. Thanks. Daniel's asking, how is funding for a project or partnership provided? Many of those partnerships, we are identifying and stewarding those partnerships and then identifying specific funding sources. Many of them are grant funded. So we're looking for foundations or other institutional giving opportunities that we will write those grants together as a partner. Kate is asking, how are kids best recruited for work in the community? That's a great question. I don't know if Eric has one simple example from one of our centers. If not, we can follow up with you, Kate.
That's a good question. I mean, I don't have a great example off the top of my head. A lot of the youth that I've worked with in the past have just come through connections within the community and personal relationships with people that help me identify a potential interested student. For the BIRDS program, this Youth Leadership Council, it was an entirely different thing. And you know, they were able to find a right partner in New York City. They were able to promote the project and ideas behind it over, you know, online. And I will say, as soon as it opened up to climate, then a lot of interest really became stimulated, and youth around actually from all the 5 boroughs plugged in and are now part of this. So I don't think I'm directly answering your question, but those were the 2 things that come to mind.
Thanks, Eric.
There's a question.
Oh, go ahead, Mike.
I was going to say that there's a question about chapter strategies and how they relate to the Audubon's bird-friendly community strategy. It's certainly, the bird-friendly community strategy is one of the 5 priority strategies identified by National Audubon. And of course, Audubon, Connecticut and New York is part of National Audubon. What we've just presented today is sort of our latest thinking on what that strategy looks like in our 2 states, how we'd like it to move forward. Some of it's new thinking. In fact, we have some of the leaders of the national strategy on the call today, and I'm sure we'll be getting their feedback afterwards and hopefully getting some good input as well. National Audubon doesn't do any kind of strategic planning for chapters. Chapters are separate organizations. So, but many of our chapters have expressed considerable interest in the issues related to the bird-friendly community strategy. And many of them, you know, like Connecticut, which was featured today, are already working closely on these issues and closely with Audubon on these issues. I don't know if that, I hope that answers the question.
Marlene has just asked, what projects, if any, are being done with campus chapters? I don't know if Laura wants to.
I can weigh in to start. So we're still in the beginning stages of identifying campus chapters in New York. We have just a couple, and in Connecticut we have some partners. Connecticut is partnered with campuses, for example, but we don't have any campus chapters officially quite yet. But we're hoping to move forward on that work, and it certainly fits in with all of the work that you heard about today, opportunities for that. So we're definitely looking forward to growing that. And those of you who are on this call who are within the chapter network and working on that, let's talk soon, because that's a next step, certainly, to get more of those campus chapters off the ground. And this is a really easy place for chapters, campus chapters to plug in, because there are things they can do on their campuses, and there's ways that they can bring their communities in that we don't have connections to yet. So more of that to come, we hope.
Another chapter related question. Are there any plans in place for a chapter-wide PRO, an effort or a celebration that's linking them together, similar to how National is doing Native Plant Week or Bird Friendly Buildings Week? I don't know if there's anything from your council meetings that they've discussed a joint effort. I know many of the chapters participating today, that representation, are working on participating in that Native Plant Week or Bird Friendly Buildings Week.
Yeah, I think a number of chapters have just participated in the pros training that took place, and that was great. That's going to be a starting point. I know a few folks who are on the call here are interested in moving forward too. So far, nothing chapter wide at a council level, but I think one-on-one, we're going to be doing some things for sure. More to come on that too.
I just wanted to circle back to add on to Eric's answer for Kate. A lot of our recruitment of kids in the community comes through our partnerships as well. I know, for example, our work with the Green Jobs Corps comes through the high school students at Common Ground, and with the Urbanscapes Nursery, those students were recruited through connections that Doreen Abubakar, who's like the head of CPEN, she had the in with the community. She knew them and their families. And so a lot of that recruitment is done from our partners on the ground who know those communities and the kids that can work within them. I hope that helps to answer the question.
Well, great. It's top of the hour. I know a lot of people need to move on to other things. I do have everyone's email addresses of who participated if you were sent the invite. So we may send you some follow-up questions. We'd love to hear from all of you what resonated. And thank you for things like Jennifer sharing that some other thoughts in the chat box. So appreciate that. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thank you all. And please don't hesitate to reach out to us with follow-up and feedback. That's what we'd really like to hear. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, everybody.
That was good.
Thanks, Dennis. I saw your comment of too kind. We were looking at Cherry Ann Street does have plenty of awesome benefits that we wanted to share. While it wasn't always our work, it was a partnership to make all that happen.
Yes.
I'm glad we have a private audience to thank you both. That was fantastic. Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Jillian. Laura, it was really wonderful. I mean, it was great the first time around, but you elaborated on some points. It's even better the second